point,
joining us today at the special event celebrating the release of Nancy Krieger's new book, Ecosocial Theory, Embodied Truths, and the People's Health. I'm Lisa Berkman and director of the Harvard Center for Population and Development Studies here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. For close to 60 years, our affiliated faculty and researchers have studied from a true interdisciplinary perspective the most pressing challenges occurring in population sciences and health. We're very grateful for the engagement Nancy has had with the center and her continued contributions to our community. In fact, Nancy's work embodies, if you can use her term, what we would say is the most important of interdisciplinary work and dialogue. We're thrilled to host this event and discuss the newest book in her series entitled Small Books, Big Ideas in Population Health. She's also a very good personal friend and colleague, so it's a special, wonderful event to host this today. So most of our events are still remaining virtual, but for this one, despite strict safety protocols, we're determined to gather with Nancy in person. So this is a true hybrid event. And as such, you'll need to forgive us if we're sometimes a little clunky for a moment or two as we transition back and forth between hybrid and in-person and virtual. We're all new at this still. So during the first few minutes, you'll hear individually from Sarah Humphreyville at Oxford University Press, who has supported this, and we're very grateful. And then I'm joined here in person by Harvard faculty, Jason Beckfield, Evelyn Hammonds, and Nancy. At some points in the program, we will have our masks on, and we'll do our best to speak loudly and clearly. Following the introductory remarks, Evelyn and Nancy will spend about 15 or 20 minutes delving into the book, and then the final 15 minutes will be left for audience questions and answers. Please submit your questions and comments via the question and answer feature in Zoom, not the chat. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge the event coordinators who did truly a remarkable job for this. Leslie Harkins, Nicole Gogan, Laura Price at the Pop Center, Emma Hudson at Oxford University Press, the terrific IT team at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, Emily Wright, a PhD student at Chan, who will be facilitating the question and answer portion of the program. So now I'd like to turn it over to the book's publisher, Sarah, and let you take it away.
Hi, everyone. It's so great to have all of you join us today for this wonderful event. We are so excited to be launching Ecosocial Theory, Embodied Truths, and the People's Health. My warm thanks to everyone at the Pop Center for sponsoring such a wonderful event, and for Dr. Hammonds for joining us for our conversation in a bit. Oxford, as a not-for-profit university press, has long been honored to have a dedicated public health publishing program. We view our role in this space as both a facilitator and a megaphone for deeply researched, cutting-edge work, and that is exactly how I would describe the book we are going to hear more about here in a bit. I've had the great good fortune to collaborate with Dr. Krieger on both this work and on the broader series in which it publishes, Small Books, Big Ideas in Population Health. Getting to have such a close collaboration with Dr. Krieger has opened my eyes to the deep interplay of the biological, social, cultural, political, behavioral, environmental factors that affect the health of populations. This interplay, which is at the heart, of course, of the book that we're going to be hearing about more shortly. For those of you who wish to purchase a copy of the book after the event, please go to the OUP website and search for it. You have the discount code somewhere in the chat or on the flyer, or you're obviously more than welcome to reach out to me directly, and I will certainly make sure a copy reaches you. Otherwise, if you're here and are thinking of perhaps adopting the book in the future, please do email me directly. I'm happy to get an exam copy your way. But with that business out of the way, I will now turn it over to Jason Beckfield, Professor of Sociology at Harvard University, to say a few words and introduce our speakers today.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I am honored and excited to be here to celebrate the work of my academic mentor, research collaborator, intellectual hero, and dear friend, Nancy Krieger, as she launches her exciting new book. Ecosocial Theory, Embodied Truths, and the People's Health explicates and extends ecosocial theory by pushing on the idea of embodiment and conceptualizing the many ways that truth and injustice are embodied. It's a lively, critical, questioning, reflective, and reflexive read. My hunch is that it will be especially useful to two kinds of readers. The first is the established scholar interested in the intellectual origins and diverse applications of Nancy's ideas. And the second is the newer scholar just entering the field and sorting out what they believe, how they think, and what kind of work they want to do. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speakers, who will then each have an opportunity to say hello before joining in conversation with each other. First, Nancy Krieger, of course, is Professor of Social Epidemiology, American Cancer Society Clinical Research Professor, and Director of the Interdisciplinary Concentration on Women, Gender, and Health at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Nancy is an internationally recognized social epidemiologist with a background in biochemistry, philosophy of science, and history of public health. In 2004, she became an ISI highly cited scientist and has over 30 years of activism involving social justice, science, and health. As part of our programming today, Nancy will be in conversation with Evelyn Hammonds, the Barbara Gutman Rosencrantz Professor of the History of Science, Professor of African and African American Studies, and Chair of the Department of the History of Science at Harvard University. Her work focuses on the intersection of scientific, medical, and socio-political concepts of race in the United States. She's currently completing a history of biological, medical, and anthropological uses of racial concepts entitled The Logic of Difference, A History of Race in Science and Medicine in the United States from 1850 to 1990. And I will now, with great pleasure, turn it over to Evelyn to say a word of welcome.
Okay, so my mask is stuck, people, and I will unstick it, I hope, successfully. Good afternoon. I'm really delighted to be here, to be in conversation with my dear friend of many, many years, Nancy Krieger. One of the things as a historian of medicine that I am most excited about Nancy and the launch of her new book, but always been excited about, is her real commitment to understanding the history of the concepts that she writes about in this new book. I think it's going to be an incredible read for many people outside of the audiences that Jason just mentioned. I think I've thought many times about the ways in which Nancy's historical perspective is coupled with her commitment to activism, which is also coupled to her commitment to rigorous epidemiological research. So I'm pleased to be here, and I'm looking forward to what I hope will be a wonderful conversation.
So I'm amazed that today is actually today, but I'm really glad to be here. And I want to start by acknowledging first that as a US person in Boston, Massachusetts, I am an Indigenous lens and I pay heed to critical Indigenous thinking. Second, I want very much to acknowledge and thank my editors at Oxford University Press who worked with me closely on this book series. First, Chad Zimmerman, and now presently Sarah Humphreybell. I'd also like to thank my colleagues and friends, Lisa Moore, George Davies-Smith, and Jason Beckfield, as well as Sarah, for giving me some really good feedback on the book as I was preparing it. I'm grateful to the staff here at the Harvard Pop Center, particularly Laura, Leslie, and Nicole for all the work that they did to pull this event together, which has been non-trivial. And I also really want to thank the staff at the Harvard Library System who have been assiduous in helping me through the many years finding the different things that I'm looking for, including during this time of COVID, which involved a little bit more creativity. I additionally want to thank Pam Waterman and Jarvis Chen, who are people that I've worked with for many years for the creative collaboration, helping to translate my ways of using ecosocial theory into rural research. And finally, because these are the kinds of conflict of interest things, or whatever one's supposed to say, so support for this book was provided in part by my 2019 sabbatical funding to write the prospectus, and then for my American Cancer Society Clinical Research Professor Awards. So a segue to the conversation that I look forward to having with my wonderful colleague, Evelyn Hammonds, whose work as a critical historian of public health, medicine, and scientific racism has long been touchstone for me. I'd like to share a few brief excerpts, comminglingly text from the book's preface and other bits. So I'll start by just reading some. Health, illness, birth, and death, they comprise the embodied truths of our existence on this planet Earth for every single biological being. It is an elementary truth that to live is to live embodied. People and all other living beings are constantly engaging with and depending on the social, biophysical, and ecological context in which life transpires. This translates to literally incorporating, bringing into the corpse, the body, that is, embodying biologically the dynamic context in which our lives are enmeshed. Patterns of population health, including in the case of people, health inequities, constitute the living record of how each population on our planet is faring. Yet elementary truths are never as simple as they appear to be. This book aims to provide a systematic rendering of the ideas and causal claims entwined with the notion of embodying injustice, meaning both embodying justice and injustice, and its implications for public health and social justice in its many interlinked forms, including but not limited to racial justice, economic justice, reproductive justice, environmental justice, climate justice, indigenous justice, queer justice, disability justice, and more. The basis of this construct is the ecosocial theory of disease distribution, which as I explained in chapter 1, and which I first articulated in 1994 and have elaborated since. Theories and their causal constructs matter because they can be a source of power for good or for ill, especially when deployed and contested in systems of governance, economics, and politics that set the terms on which people on this planet can either thrive or be treated as entities to be exploited for the private gain of a few. Using concrete examples to illustrate critical concepts, the goal of this book is to use the ecosocial theory of disease distribution to promote clear thinking about the distinct but connected realities of embodying injustice and embodied truths, together as they played out in the lived realities of emergent embodied phenotypes. Among the examples considered are in chapter 2, some of my own work on Jim Crow and ongoing racialized health inequities in the US, the social and biological realities of breast cancer inequities, and the combined impact of physical, social, and relationship hazards on workers' health. Additional examples in chapter 3 pertain to embodied truths and causal narratives in the service of health justice in relation to police violence, climate change, links between fossil fuel extraction and sexually transmitted infectious diseases, the health benefits of organic food for whom, public monuments, symbols of the people's health, and lastly, light, vision, and the health of people and other species. Running throughout is a call to reject biological essentialism and instead embrace embodied integration of soma, psyche, and the social and biophysical world of which we and all organisms are a part, co-inhabit, and co-create, albeit in the case of people, not equally so, but always another world is possible. Finally, to give further context to my arguments, as you've already heard, this book is the fourth in a series that I initiated and am editing for Oxford University Press. I'm happy to say that 2 additional ones are in the works, one on causal inference in the people's health, one on epigenetics in the people's health, and the others are in discussion, including on indigenous well-being, settler colonialism, and the people's health. And as for the actual context of writing, because context always matters, I want to flag that I began working on this book's text in mid-January 2020, when only whispers of a possible new infectious disease with pandemic potential began circulating into global awareness. I continued writing until mid-March and then had to halt when the demands of dealing with COVID-19 and health inequities in the US, on top of all the other COVID disruptions to work and life, became my priority. Added to this was the horrific public murder of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020 by the Minneapolis police, one which, building on far too many before, sparked subsequent weeks and months of mass protests throughout the US and globally against not only police violence, but also structural racism more broadly. Addressing racial injustice in health, including in relation to other forms of social injustice, has been central to my work as a social epidemiologist since the start of my professional career, and indeed part of why I entered this field. In March 2020, I thus put aside work on this book given the urgent demands to put my epidemiologic skills swiftly to use to the work at hand regarding data, debate, and action around COVID-19, police violence, and structural racism more generally. I was able to revisit the writing in brief moments during the summer of 2020, then put it again for much of the fall, given the demands of school, the pandemic, and of course, the presidential and other elections. Nevertheless, in late December, as the contest over the elections began to recede and vaccines started to become available, I completed a first draft, and I could return to my writing. I completed a first draft just days before the anti-democratic violent assault on the US Capitol on January 6, 2021, and in February, with comments from colleagues in hand, revised while the impeachment trial was underway. This is writing in the real world in context. Living through 2020 and a myriad efforts to mobilize for health justice served only to strengthen my resolve to prepare this book. My intent is to provide clarity about the nature of the embodied truths revealed by population patterns of health, so as to hold accountable the systems, institutions, and individuals that promote the degradation and plunder of people on this planet for the benefit of a few. During the past decade, there has been a global rise in reactionary attacks on the ideas, policies, scientific evidence, and movements needed for people and life on this planet to thrive equitably. The urgency of repelling and exposing these repellent attacks is more important than ever. Yet when it comes to the people's health, we need not only critical political and economic analysis, but also deep engagement with biology, the societal, ecological, and historical context. Such knowledge is necessary on its own terms for effective action, and also to counter dominant narratives that continue to attribute primary causal agency to people's allegedly innate biology, aka genomes, and their allegedly individual and decontextualized health behaviors. Hence this book, to illuminate critical ecosocial theorizing about embodying justice and embodied truths so as to strengthen work for the people's health. The collective challenge is for we who value health equity and human rights to contribute our part to the global project of ensuring the terms whereby all can thrive, alive to the sensuous possibilities of living engaged, generative, and loving lives on this planet for generations to come.
So Nancy, now we have a chance to talk about your wonderful book. The first question, there are two big questions that I want us to chat about. The first is why ecosocial? And I'd like you to talk about that and give a short example. Why embodied truths? And give a short example, and especially focus on the notion of truths. So first, ecosocial.
So I came to Ecosocial years ago when I was fussing with trying to figure out how to frame what I wanted to look at. I knew it was more than social because it couldn't just be social because it involved biology. I knew it couldn't be biosocial because the eugenicists had taken that in as their term, and the journals that had biosocial in the name were all fundamentally about biological determinism, which I was not interested in. And looking at the journals, it just didn't seem, and plus biosocial leaves out the fact that we live on this planet Earth and that the ecology, for me, ecology is not a metaphor, it's a reality, it's a lived reality. I was just reading a new book that came out on the mother tree, really talking about the science of understanding how trees are connected through the mycorrhiza and the fungi that connect them and the roots and the density of that and the true chemical communication. If we don't understand that we live in a real sensuous biophysical planet with many other species than ourselves, biosocial always just seemed to end up prioritizing humans above all else. With ecosocial, it really was about real ecology and also not ecology as a metaphor. There's a social ecological theory that's very widely used in public health, which only refers to nested hierarchies, which is, people live in a neighborhood, they have schools, they have kids nested in their homes and their schools and their cities. But it, again, completely left out the rest of the ecology, the rest of the ecosystem, the rest of the biological organisms with whom our lives are interdependent. So that's why I chose ecosocial. And the eco modified the social because the social is what, for me, sets the terms at this point on which the biological can survive or wilt. And so it was giving that kind of weight to it. And it was also never with a hyphen because it was the words put together. And so, and because I can't understand population health without thinking about society, without thinking about ecosystems, and without thinking about history. So it doesn't have history quite in the title,
Right.
but if you understand ecology and history, go back to Demansky, right? Nothing happens that you can understand without reference to history, evolutionary biology, evolution or otherwise. So that's why. The short
Well, I always appreciate your turn to history. And now, what about why embodied truths? And I really want you to give us an example to walk us through how you got to the notion of embodiment connected to truths.
So that came because looking at so much of the disinformation, climate denialism, attacks on evidence that are about how injustice harms health was making it all just as if it was a matter of opinion. And it's not a matter of opinion. It's actually embodied history. To show that these are demonstrable harms, and also if you show that they have embodied impacts on people's bodies, you have a different standing in court. And the standing in court really matters because you've harmed people. And that's been crucial to the lawsuits. If you look at all the fights about big tobacco, went from individuals could choose their own whatever behaviors, but the moment you have secondhand smoke and you start harming other people, you've moved it to a whole new disparate place. That's part of the issues that are going on right now about COVID. It's not just your own choice, it's having implications for other people. I'm watching the pushback. When you get embodied harm, you have a different stand on which to organize, and it also bodies integrate. And movements can get integrated through understanding what the common assaults are that are manifested through people's health, and people care about health. So the embodied truths are that this is not, you can have big arguments, and that's the nature of science. You're going to have big arguments over what explains the observed patterns that you see.
Yes.
But the patterns that you see are truths. If they are facts that are lived and then they are thought over and interpreted. And so embodied truths were to give integrated approach, an approach that has standing for people that are active trying to change what those truths are to move to a better place. And so I came to embodied truths and took truth deliberately, provocatively, because we are in a period where there is such disinformation that is well-funded. The Koch brothers have been doing it for decades to take away from environmental pollution and what the climate crisis is, to take away from the absolute harms that structural racism has on people's health. And when you come up with, again, embodied truths that are documented through the population patterns of health, it's a different set of arguments. And then, yes, there are arguments. You will find the people that are denying that many people have died of COVID thus far. But those deaths still have ripple effects. You still know it. It's not like that's going to just disappear from the social fabric.
So there's a way in which you're using truth in many respects about specific kinds of facts, or is it more than that?
It's more than that, and that's where one of the epigraphs that I have in the book is from Toni Morrison, which is about truth is more than facts, because truth requires human intelligence. There are lots of facts. The videos that I show in my class that I teach this fall, has somebody who's involved in the work against creation science, so-called, intelligent design, saying facts are a dime a dozen. Theory is what really matters. So the idea is that because you don't know how to interpret facts without theory, and truths involve an interpretation. Truths are saying that there is something that is true about the population patterns of health. They're not just facts, but they contain truths of our society. That how did that health get patterned that way? It's not a matter of atomistic, unconnected individuals. There's a deeper thing behind this. And so that's where truths also manages to, for me, have some salience and relevance.
And as I noted before, you've always been deeply interested and always used a lot of historical examples. So embodied histories, why that?
So embodied histories, because in public health, you get a lot of life course issues development across the lifespan, but not in the historical generation. When I was trying to understand what I was looking at in data, on particularly Black-white health inequities in the US, to do that without understanding, not just what's happening now, but the histories, and particularly the continued histories of the impact of Jim Crow, which is a lot what I discuss in chapter 2, in the present, reminding people, just when I was in class and teaching this the other day, reminding people I was alive when Jim Crow was still the law of the land. I'm 61, whatever. And so, but where does most health and mortality issues happen? So it was about saying that if I don't understand that embodied history, if I know that to be 32 in 1932 is not the same to be 32 in 2021, what's that about? Where do you bring that history in? So you're embodying that history of what you have done in your own life course, but it's also of the society at that time. And you can't understand the health patterns if you don't pay attention to that history. I remember one of my early professors in epidemiology, Noel Weiss, he gave this example of trying to ask about comparing age-specific mortality rates in the, people in the 1940s versus, the 1980s at that point. And a big point was that there was this thing called the Immigration Restriction Act. It completely changed who the population was in the US. And you can't just say that the age equals the age from one point to another if you don't take into account there's been a historical social structure in who the population is. So I can't not think about populations except in history, and history in terms of the societal conflicts of their times.
So that's, the story's coming together for me. But also you turned in the later chapters to talking about vision. And vision, the value of thinking about vision for, but not just against. And you mean vision in multiple senses. So would you want to give us an example of what you were thinking through in that?
So, theory is fundamentally about vision. Theory is, it means inner vision from its ancient roots in Greek. And it's about how do we see and understand the causal processes that we think are at play in the phenomena we're concerned about. So I can't think about, again, population health without thinking theoretically, why is this playing out as it is? What are the right comparison groups to try to understand that? And vision is about it all. But vision is also really important because the examples that I use is that vision is both metaphorical and literal. And theory always has me moving back and forth between that which is biophysically tangible and that which is metaphorical and critical for our thinking. And so the examples that I was using was one is that, we live on a planet which goes around the sun, and most people, I think, agree. And light is crucial. Light is crucial to every single living organism. And so what's happening with light pollution? What's happening with the way that climate change is beginning to decouple temperature and light, because we go around the sun the same way, whether or not it gets hotter or it gets warmer. And what is that going to do biologically? But then also because I got very interested in vision, because I was trying for a while to figure out, are there any health patterns in society, any societies that show no social pattern? And that was it really took a lot. And the only one that I came up with that seemed to be true across, you name the society, you name the social gradient, it's not there, is people starting in their mid-40s having their eyes go to the top because the little muscles on the back don't work. And that doesn't show a social gradient, but what it does is myopia, a very strong social gradient. And that one of the data that I have is that, when they first did the big national health examination surveys in the 1960s, there was an enormous difference for Black versus white, and by economic level, in myopia, white kids and better off kids were more likely to be reading a lot more. And so you had a very big gap. By the time you get to the 80s, the gap has almost disappeared. And that's not a good going away of a gap, because it means everybody's getting more myopia. But it also means people are reading more. But then what does that mean? Is that a permanent fact that people we're gonna have these kids? And then if you have kids, if you get myopia, if you don't get glasses and corrective lenses, you are absolutely gonna be disadvantaged with regard to getting education. If you can't see, it's going to really interfere. So you've got both. It's better to be reading more, but it's not good if you're reading more and you can't actually see. But then there's new research coming out that is suggesting that this kind of myopia, which is going up in countries all around the world, and kids, and China is having it really bad right now, is that if kids actually, and this gets back to the beginning of the book, if kids actually can see outside, if they're looking at horizons, if they're actually looking at trees, it actually, and that's integrated as part of school. It's understanding that you have to relate to the real world, not to the screen in front of you, not to a virtual reality, but to real world with real distance, with vision. You might not get such myopia. So that was my way of tying the different examples together.
I think that's a great one. You started in your introduction to talk about writing this book in what we would now say in the time of plague.
Exactly.
And you talked about different interruptions, but do you think that starting this book and how you pulled it together, can you say something at this point about how being in this particular moment shaped what was driving you and what you were thinking about? Because you're still doing your work. You were actually getting involved in trying to get data about COVID, from various sources, and a lot of other things you were up to, as well as just trying to write.
Yeah, and I was going crazy. I mean, the way I described this period was I was doing minimally 3 jobs, because I was doing my regular job, I was doing all the COVID disruptions to my job, and then I was taking on with particularly Jarvis and Pam and some others, Bill Minaj and others, unfunded COVID work just to do it, because the data on equity, health equity in COVID was terrible. I mean, the new COVID-19 Health Equity Task Force is fixing that up. The data have gotten better at CDC, but under X number 45, the data were horrific. And you could not see what the inequities were. And that's wrong. So how do you start to fix that? So those are the things where, again, bringing the epidemiologic skills swiftly to bear. And it just made me all the more clear that I wanted to get this book written, because it's conveying a way of thinking that is tractable. It is conveying a way of thinking that can lead other people to do more work, better work, engaged work, connected work, to not be fearful of doing this kind of work, maybe, but to really try to make the connections with others and show how intellectually, how do you use this theory? So it's very concrete as the book in terms of, like,
Sorry, I think there was a technical difficulty. I'm going to get the stream back up. Sorry.
So welcome back, everybody. We promised you it might be a little bit clunky. We have fulfilled our end of the bargain. Here. So we're gonna now turn and just ask, I have one brief question, and I think Jason will ask something, and then we'll turn on to questions and answers. But I wondered, as Evelyn was drilling down so beautifully on what ecosocial theory was and embodied truths, what we didn't talk about was people's health. And often we refer to population health. Now, the most compelling term, but you've embraced people's health, not only for your book, but for the whole series. Can you talk a little bit about, like, why not population health, or what do you mean by people's health?
So sure, so I think, thank you for that question. I think is that by saying that people's health is meant to be for the people, it is meant to be a health equity focus. It goes, population is a term that can be used for marbles, it can be used for galaxies, it can be used for lots of things that are not about people and societies, and doesn't involve justice. And the people's health has a connotation that brings in questions of justice and therefore also injustice. I do know that I'm a population health scientist. I think that there's a phrase of population health science that I can live with the whole three words stuck together. But I'm not interested in just talking about populations, because populations of what? And I have an article like who and what defines a population, and that gets into a lot of noise. I think of the boundaries, who's in, who's out, who's defined it, what does it mean? What does it mean? Are people talking about it from the standpoint of genealogy? Are they talking about it from the standpoint of statistical inference and sampling and the different things? There are so many different contested meanings of population. When I say the people's health, it's making it really clear that this is about health and societal context. And you can't just like block that out as an abstract thing. So that's why I use it, but I will identify as being a population health scientist, and I am somebody who's also in the field of public health. So I use those terms as they make sense, but the title was of the series in part was to again emphasize that notion of the integral relationship between social justice and public health, and that comes through to me about speaking about the people's health, but not as a right-wing populist.
And now we turn to Jason.
Speaking of politics, I think one of the really inspiring things about your work, Nancy, is the way that you balance doing science and doing political engagement. And I'm curious if you can just share a few of your thoughts, and I know you thought very deeply about this, on how you see the relationship between just science and the politics of justice.
So I can't think of science as being apolitical. I can think that there are people that don't want to identify the political context of their science, but that's very different. To say that science has no politics is not saying that it has no politics. If people want to just say, I'm just doing lifestyle theory, it's apolitical. No, it isn't, because you've left out the societal context that is shaping, constraining the possibilities for people to live in ways that are actually healthy. So I don't frame it as politics versus science. I want to understand the politics in science. Sometimes they're overt in terms of what's being funded versus what's being suppressed overtly. But sometimes it's about the deep ideas that are built into it. And the ideas of deep individualism and biological essentialism are packaged with a political understanding of the world. And that's a political understanding that assumes that individuals are the a priori unit and everything flows from individuals. And that's a very different way from the ways in which life on our planet actually exists, which is interconnected within species and across species. And if somebody wants to try to like do life on their own on a little island by themselves, good luck doing it. If they want to do anything resembling other sort of details and be part of the cycle of life. So for me, but political interference is a different question, and politically cherry picking what you want results, what you want to look at. The nature of doing science and testing your ideas is they have to be fair tests that other people can do with the same ideas with the same kinds of data to see if your hypotheses fly or not. That's about living in the real world and doing science in the real world. So that gets back to the shared assumption of the shared biophysical reality in which independent investigators can formulate and test their ideas. And then you can go crazy over challenging the basic concepts that they use. Look at what's happening now, and Evelyn, you've been involved with this around work around sort of beginning to deconstruct the medical algorithms that have just built race, quote unquote, into it without really even thinking thinking about what race is, or assuming that they know and actually not. And you might want to say a few words about that, but that's where it looks like it's apolitical. This is just a test for kidney function. And actually it's got like a lot more behind it with really bad implications for harming people's health. So I find that I want to understand how political conflict and contest and questions of justice and injustice shape the very ideas that I use and the data that I use to test the hypotheses that I'm interested in to come up with actionable data. I mean, do you want to say something about that from your standpoint and what you?
Yeah, well, I mean, right now there's a huge, I would say, reckoning would be probably the right word, about ways in which measurements of different bodies has been incorporated into machines. And one of the first examples of this that many people cite is one of my former students and colleagues, Lundy Brown's work on the history of the Park spirometer, which measures lung function, which began as people began to do this, as white physicians began to do this, began to notice that argue that there was a difference in lung capacity. And so if you had a machine that was measuring lung capacity, you needed to make sure that you had the right correction so that you could analyze the differences that you could see between whites and blacks. Except that the notion that there was different lung capacities was actually being built into the machine. So the machine was measuring what was already a artifact, which was already a way of thinking that Black people had different lung capacities than whites, and we just make machines to make sure that that is reified. And then many other kinds of machines measuring kidney function and other things were also incorporating these different kinds of race corrections, as they're called. And so in recent, I would say even just the last 6 months, there's been huge discussion about what the now algorithms that are built into these measurements and then built into machines. What is it actually doing? Is there really a racial difference? It depends on how you define race. And so there's been a great deal of discussion, lots of publications, things happening very fast. And in some respects, people are re-examining the basic fundamental premise that of these measurements and how they're being brought forward. And of course, it's important because it means that some people aren't getting the treatment that they should because these machines are wrong. What they put out about differences is wrong. And so it's a good moment. It's a complicated moment. There's resistance to change about it. And all the kinds of things that Nancy's talking about. There's politics all over the place in this story. But certain kinds of politics I think is a good moment in some respects. And it's a challenging moment for a lot of people who would rather rest on the notion that there's this fundamental innate biological difference between these groups that we define by race.
And so this is where in the book, part of what I do is really build out the ideas of biological expressions of injustice and ways in which people will read injustice as part of the normal biology of people, and you can challenge it. So there's, you can talk about racialized expressions of injustice. You can talk about the ways in which you also have interpretations that are unjust of the biology. And so the book, because if we live in an unjust society, you're going to see differences between groups in the health status because of the injustice. But that doesn't mean that they're innate. I mean, it would be completely weird if you didn't see those differences. But are those differences then assumed to be intrinsic versus how do you tie them and how do you rigorously test those ideas? So that's where, again, the politics gets woven into the very ideas and the conduct of science. It's not just about, but there also is the very overt, horrible versions of politics like data suppression that we saw at the beginning of the COVID pandemic.
So, Emily, you and I didn't. Emily on the screen, thank you. Do we have some questions from the chat?
Yes, we have a number of questions that have come in, one of which was submitted ahead of time by an attendee that asks, how do you envision this book will impact public health researchers and practitioners during the ongoing impact of COVID-19?
The book does include a variety of COVID-related examples so people can think through what this means for COVID, but I think it also gives a way of thinking to say, how do you understand the way in which the pandemic is playing out? You need to understand something about the virus. And by the way, thank goodness for the basic research that allows for the understanding of the virus, that allows for quick creation moving forward in technology that had been there but not put into such mass production around the mRNA vaccines in particular. You know, it's one thing that it allows you to think about the biology and societal context. My book is not an argument at all against using basic science. It's understanding that the questions that basic science answers need to be integrated into a way of engaging with public health issues that are before us, but they're not a substitute for engaging with the public health issues. It was very telling to me to read, you know, it just got announced the other week that Francis Collins will be stepping down as head of the NIH. And one question he was asked about, you know, a big surprise to him was how there was so much resistance to the vaccines. And he was thinking that perhaps NIH should have maybe invested some more money in social science. So it's again about you can't deal with biology and public health without dealing with the rest of the world. So I hope that this book gives a lot of very concrete examples as to how to do that.
Another question we have asks, you've talked eloquently about the use of ecosocial theory to describe patterns of health and disease in social and ecological and biological contexts. Could you talk about using the theory to develop and evaluate actions and interventions to address health inequities?
So there are some examples again in the book that are about that. The two that I bring out are particularly in chapter 3 that go into this. Well, there's a few more than that, but two I'll talk about here. One is around police violence and the other is around climate change. So part of the point was that who are your allies and what does it mean? So to move the issues of the police violence, which have been long documented, have been long known to the people that are in communities that are afflicted by the police violence, to make new allies and bring new credibility and new options for intervention by bringing out the public health features of it, by actually having a reporting of the deaths and accounting of the deaths and accounting of the misclassification of the deaths and the undercount of the deaths, by virtue of bringing in the standard public health expertise, because public health people, and this is what got me going on this a while ago, was in a conversation with people that were here in Boston, the ACLU, that had a decades-long suit around the police trying to get their records and how hard it was to get the mortality data. And I'm sitting there thinking, as a little public health person, we count dead people all the time. So what's the problem here? How can we not know as public health people what the mortality records are about police violence? And so we did, I've been involved in work with my doctoral students, work that I led, and now other people have, you know, really been taking it up. And then that gets new evidence moving forward, and now new questioning of what's happening with medical coroner reports and what is actually being filed. And that really matters. And that has relations to the people that are active in the concerns about police violence, people that are in legal worlds, people that are in social worlds and others, to take new alliances and actually get new traction to working on this problem. And similarly with the work around climate justice is, you know, much of the early work focused on the environmental impacts, but not so much the human health impacts. And you can trace through the different IPCC statements. And human health had very little place, of virtually none in the beginning. And you know, now it's like really ballooned because it's again back to the embodied truths of existence. It's happening. It's in people's bodies. It's going forward in the next generations. But also it becomes new evidence for action and new alliances that can form to make action and new possibilities again for legal suits, which are a very compelling form of argument.
Great, and now we have two questions that are somewhat similar to one another in kind of substantive application. One asks, or first says, congratulations from Ecuador. We study your category embodiment in the doctoral program, collective health, environment, and society. Can you tell us how your new book can contribute to food and health studies? And the related question submitted ahead of time was, how can we use the theory in designing programs on health and nutrition?
So what I hope for is people will be creative in figuring this out. I have my bits of expertise of the parts of kinds of biological systems that I've studied closely. Others have looked at other parts. So I give different examples, but clearly one of the points of ecosocial theory is constantly understanding the integration and connection between levels. So you have to understand nutrients, but you have to understand diets, but you have to understand where people actually get their food, but you have to actually think about food systems affecting where people get their food. You have to think about who is actually growing the food, under what conditions. And so the example that I give in the book about the question of organic food, good for whom, I'll just use that as the one example, is that when looking at the literature, it was quite striking that a lot of the literature on organic food, if you look at it now, is geared to the quote unquote consumer. Is it good for the consumer to eat organic food or not? And the evidence is somewhat equivocal. But what is not equivocal, it is very clear that for many other species, it makes a really big difference if you're not using pesticides all over the place in terms of and the ecosystem damage. And not only that, if you're not poisoning people who are applying the pesticides, and the amount of poisoning of people who apply pesticides, farm workers, in this country, particularly undocumented farm workers, is humongous. So if you're going to come up with a statement about organic food, it can't just be organic food. It's who's producing it, under what conditions, affecting whose health, and the who has to be bigger than people, because it has to include the rest of the world if you're going to be doing things like applying pesticides. So I think that's a way that ecosocial theory can link those things. And it's not to say that, you're not concerned about the individual impact of what you personally ingest, but you're ingesting water and air too. That's separate from whether, that is affected by what the other pollutants are. So that gets back to the very first question that you were asking, which is really taking ecology seriously in understanding the framing, and then also really taking the political economy seriously in terms of where and how, what's going on with food production. And that gets into much bigger conversations, but that should be enough to get anybody working in nutrition something to chew over. That's it. Very good.
All right, and in the last couple of minutes, I believe we'll wrap up the Q&A at 4:55. One question we received asks, do you discuss capitalism and what effects living in a capitalistic society has on ecosocial theory and health?
Well, the point is not just capitalism, because one, as Jason can speak to eloquently, maybe I'll put you on the spot, there are many varieties. What is the Anglo-Saxon version is not the same as the Nordic social democratic state version, is not the same as what's in France or Germany, et cetera, et cetera. Secondly, ecosocial theory works for socialism. It works for what might be ideals of, if there ever were, pre-industrial society versions of what was then, quote unquote, communism, let alone what might be envisioned in the future. It says whatever the political economy is, it's going to lead to embodied truths in the health of the population. So it's not, yes, it can be used to critique avaricious capitalism that is geared to prioritization of private profit above all else, but it can also be about how you have actually better social democratic states with better social welfare systems that lead to actually fewer health inequities. So that's as much a question for ecosocial theory as it is, and then understanding which generation you've looked at, because it's not like, the post-war society is not the same as the pre-war society, is not the same as the post-World War II versus post-1980 neoliberal regime society. So you have to always contextualize it. So I wouldn't want to frame this as only something, you can absolutely use it to critique what goes on with the egregious prioritization of private profit above all else. But you can also look at it for the health equity side. What does it mean to actually have more equitable, just, and sustainable economies, and what that should turn into in terms of population health patterns?
Great. And perhaps one more that could end on a note of the books coming up in the series. Someone asks, I'm excited that you are doing work on epigenetics. Do you see epigenetics as a way of refining our understanding of disease causation while bypassing biological essentialism?
So there's a lot of different ideas out there about epigenetics, but the key point is that obviously gene expression matters, not just gene frequency. Because otherwise we as humans, among others, come from like a little gamete, and yet we have different organ systems. So the only way that can happen is control of gene expression, right? Because it's all from the same little gamete. And yes, you can have chimeras and other things like that, but we're not gonna go into those details. And so epigenetics is one pathway that may involve the regulation of the gene expression that's involved in many different kinds of ways of developmental systems in biology, but also what become potentially pathogenic pathways, potentially salutogenic pathways. But again, you can also have things where it's not only going to be epigenetics in a crude sense, whereas, for example, if I walk out in front of a car and get run over, that's like a biophysical injury, and I don't care what my genome is like and what genes are being expressed, that's going beyond the limits of what a human can endure to be run over and be hit by a car. So and then there's great inequities and risk of traffic fatalities in terms of who has sidewalks, who doesn't, who has good traffic light systems, who doesn't, et cetera, et cetera. So, so any of those things will mean that, yes, epigenetics is going to be one of the things that's there in terms of some of that kind of regulation, but some kinds of insults are going to affect everybody to a point where it doesn't really matter what your underlying genome was and what the gene expression was, because it's just not compatible with human life. So it's to put it in perspective. And yes, it can be against, some will say it does challenge genetic determinism, but there are others in the real realm of epigenetic research that are like your methylation patterns are fundamentally genetically determined. So it's not a simple out. And I'm involved in epigenetic research right now because I'm curious and I want to see, can you see the footprints of societal injustice past and present in people's current epigenetic marks and what that might mean for their health? But I'm very aware that there are debates that say that, nope, it's almost all pre-written how you're going to end up getting methylated. So it's not so simple that epigenetics means the end of genetic determinism. And there's an awful lot of empirical research to do to figure that out.
Great. Thank you. With that, I'll turn it back over and we'll wrap up on Q&A.
Great. Well, I want to thank the both of you for a really wonderful talk. Nancy, the book is enormously important. I think as everybody has made the point, it stretches across disciplines. It stretches from kind of academic contributions to practice to how we think about politics and contribution that it makes to determinants of health. Really, I thought, hope everybody goes out and buys it. It's a really terrific contribution. And Evelyn, thank you so much for your contributions. Really, your perspective on history is always, for me, really interesting to hear, and your take on the contributions that science makes towards how we think about race and ethnicity is just central to our thinking. In this, Jason also for contributing introduction. And really, I'd like to make a very special shout out to Oxford, because as I'm sitting here looking at the books behind us, I realize that Oxford has been truly deeply committed to this area across a number of disciplines, from when 200 copies of a book were sold and they were really happy when it sold for decades. And really, I don't know where we would be without, honestly, the support that Oxford has made to this area. It's really, really pushed it forward. So Sarah, thank you very much for this and for Oxford's really continued sort of commitment to the issue. I also want to thank all the folks who helped make it possible, whose names I read at the beginning. All the IT, Leslie, Laura, Nicole, everybody. It's been really masterful. I feel like I said before, I think this may be the most scripted that I've been to recently. We could go on CBS News now. And so again, just thank you all for joining us today, in spite of the little clunks. And we really hope everybody takes away from this important messages. I just want to say that the event, the recording will be available on the Pop Center website within a couple of weeks. And the recording will be there, as well as a link. I think maybe in the chat, there's a link to both a promo code for the book, and it will be available. So we wish everybody good reading, and thank you all for your contributions. Yay!